the finest!
Final Fantasy Adventure. Final Fantasy Adventure. Where do we start? Well, let's begin with the fact that it's not really a Final Fantasy game. It's the first entry in the Mana series, which is an entirely different beast. But that's not the worst part. The game's clunky interface feels like you're trying to control a character with your hands tied behind your back, and the story is as shallow as a puddle. The soundtrack, while not entirely terrible, is extremely repetitive and will have you wishing you could turn off the music altogether. Finally, let's talk about the grinding. Prepare to spend countless hours hacking and slashing at enemies to level up, only to find the next boss still effortlessly smashes you into the ground. Brutal. Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. Oh, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, the redhead stepchild of this series. Designed as a beginner's RPG for the West, it is insultingly simplistic. The game holds your hand like you're a toddler crossing the street, with no room for exploration or deviation from its linear path. The story is as bland as unsalted rice cakes, and the characters have all the depth of a puddle in the Sahara Desert. While the soundtrack is admittedly catchy, it can't save this game from being a monotonous slog. The combat system is so basic, it feels like you're just going through the motions, and even the boss battles are a yawn-inducing walk in the park. To sum it up, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest is a perfect example of how dumbing down a game can rob it of its soul. Final Fantasy Tactics. Oh, Final Fantasy Tactics, a game that simultaneously delights and frustrates its players. The job system, while innovative, is like navigating a labyrinth filled with dead ends and hidden traps. Unlocking some jobs feels like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube blindfolded. And when you finally manage to obtain your desired class, be prepared for the grind. Leveling up in this game is a patience-testing exercise in monotony. The story, on the other hand, is as intricate as the job system. So much so that you'll need a flowchart to keep track of all the characters and plot lines. And let's not forget the difficulty spikes, which are as sharp as the pointy ends of a dragoon's lance. Nothing like a sudden, crushing defeat to remind you of your own inadequacy, eh? Final Fantasy XI Online. Final Fantasy XI Online, the MMO that took the massively parts a bit too seriously. For starters, it requires a level of dedication that would make a monk envious. The grind in this game makes Sisyphus pushing a boulder up a hill look like a light workout. And then there's the forced partying mechanic. If you're a solo player, tough luck, mate. You'll spend more time trying to find a group than actually playing the game. Navigating through the world of Vana'diel is like trying to find your way through a maze while blindfolded, with every zone feeling like a sprawling labyrinth designed to confuse and disorient. And let's not forget the notorious, unforgiving death penalty. There's nothing quite like losing hours of progress because of an ill-timed sneeze. Final Fantasy XI Online truly is the Dark Souls of MMOs, without any of the satisfaction. Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles. Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, a game that had so much potential but was ultimately marred by its own ambition. First and foremost, let's talk about the multiplayer aspect. To play this game with friends, you needed not only a GameCube, but also a Game Boy Advance and a link cable for each person. A logistical nightmare that would make even the most organized party planner weep. The gameplay itself is a repetitive cycle of dungeon crawling, boss fights, and gathering items, with no satisfying progression or variety to keep things interesting. The caravan system, while an interesting idea, is poorly implemented and feels like a chore rather than a fun part of the game. And the story? Oh, the story. It's so thinly spread out that it's like trying to scrape a single dollop of butter over an entire loaf of bread. Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles is a prime example of how an interesting concept can be bogged down by weak execution. Final Fantasy X-2. Final Fantasy X-2, the sequel that no one really asked for. It's like someone took Final Fantasy X, turned it upside down, and shook out all the gravitas and seriousness, leaving behind a brightly colored mess of pop culture and fan service. The story is so convoluted and filled with plot holes that you'll need a spelunking gear to navigate its depths. The characters, once complex and engaging, have been reduced to caricatures of their former selves, with Yuna's transformation into a pop star being the prime example.
No!
The battle system, while a nice departure from the traditional turn-based combats, ends up being a chaotic frenzy of button mashing and costume changes. And let's not even get started on the side quests, a mind-numbing array of minigames and fetch quests that feel like they were designed to pad out the game's runtime. Final Fantasy X-2 is a stark reminder that not every story needs a sequel, especially when that sequel feels like a fever dream of its predecessor. Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, a game that somehow manages to make the tactics genre feel like a slog through a swamp. The story is a watered-down version of its predecessor, lacking any real depth or weight, as if someone took the original script and put it through a shredder. The gameplay is a slow, tedious affair, with battles feeling like they last an eternity, especially when you factor in the constant, infuriating misses. The law system, while an interesting concept, is more of an annoyance than a strategic challenge, forcing you to adhere to arbitrary rules that change with each battle. The character development is about as shallow as a kiddie pool, with most party members feeling interchangeable and forgettable. And don't even get me started on the grind. You'll need the patience of a saint to level up and unlock new jobs. Final Fantasy Tactics Advance is like a watered-down cocktail. All the elements are there, but they're so diluted that you're left feeling unsatisfied. Dirge of Cerberus, Final Fantasy VII. Dirge of Cerberus, Final Fantasy VII. Where to begin with this dumpster fire of a spin-off? It's a third-person shooter that feels like it was made by someone who's never played a third-person shooter before. The controls are clunky, the camera is a nightmare, and the level design is as uninspired as a bowl of plain oatmeal. The story is a convoluted mess filled with plot holes and inconsistencies that make even the most diehard Final Fantasy VII fans cringe. The characters, both new and returning, are a collection of cardboard cutouts, with Vincent's brooding taking center stage in the most melodramatic way possible. And let's not forget the shoehorned RPG elements like leveling up and materia, which feel as out of place as a clown at a funeral. Dirge of Cerberus is another glaring example of how not to do a spin-off and a stain on the otherwise beloved Final Fantasy VII universe. Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings. Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings, the sequel that took everything great about its predecessor and tossed it out the window like a moldy sandwich. This game is a strange hybrid of real-time strategy and RPG elements that, quite frankly, doesn't quite work. The touchscreen controls are about as responsive as a sloth on tranquilizers, making battles more of a chore than a joy. The story is an uninspired rehash of Final Fantasy XII's plot, with none of the political intrigue or depth. Character development is virtually non-existent, with the majority of the cast feeling like pale imitations of their already boring selves. And let's not forget the horrendous difficulty spikes. One moment you're breezing through battles, the next you're being stomped into the ground by a relentless boss. Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII. Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII, a prequel that tried to shine a light on the untold story of Zack Fair, but ended up casting some serious shadows. The combat system is a confusing mishmash of real-time and turn-based elements that leaves you feeling like you're fighting both the enemies and the game itself. The DMW slot machine mechanic, while flashy, is an exercise in frustration, as it's entirely based on luck. Good luck getting those limit breaks when you need them. The story, while touching on some interesting aspects of the Final Fantasy VII universe, is bogged down by convoluted plot lines and retcons that feel forced and unnatural. The new characters introduced in the game feel shoehorned in, diluting the impact of the original game's narrative. And don't even get me started on the repetitive missions. You'll spend more time doing the same tasks over and over than actually enjoying the game. Crisis Core had the potential to be a worthy addition to the Final Fantasy VII canon, but instead is a reminder that some things are better left in the past. Oh, and another one.
Activating combat mode.
Final Fantasy Tactics A2 Grimoire of the Rift. Final Fantasy Tactics A2 Grimoire of the Rift. A game that takes the term sequel and beats it with the same tired stick over and over again. The story is as generic as they come, filled with one-dimensional characters and a plot that's more predictable than a fortune cookie. The law system, while slightly improved from its predecessor, still feels like an unnecessary hindrance that adds artificial difficulty to battles. The side quests are an exercise in monotony, requiring you to complete the same task again and again with little variation or reward. The character progression is a maze of complexity, forcing you to juggle multiple jobs and abilities just to stay afloat in the game's sea of mediocrity. And finally, the graphics. While an upgrade from the original Tactics Advance, they still feel dated and lack the charm of the other Final Fantasy titles. Final Fantasy Tactics A2 is like a photocopy of a photocopy. Each iteration loses something vital, leaving you with a pale imitation of what once was. Final Fantasy IV: The After Years. Final Fantasy IV: The After Years, a sequel that should have stayed in the past where it belongs. The story is a rehash of Final Fantasy IV's narrative, complete with recycled plot points and a been-there-done-that vibe that permeates every pixel. The episodic structure, while an interesting concept, falls flat on its face, with each chapter feeling disjointed and poorly paced.
Stop it.
The battle system is a tired retreat of the original game's combat, with no meaningful innovations or improvements to speak of. Yep, the band's included. The character development is virtually non-existent, with the majority of the cast feeling like mere shadows of their former selves. And let's not forget the egregious use of random encounters. It's like the game is punishing you for daring to explore its world. Final Fantasy IV: The After Years is the video game equivalent of reheating leftovers. It's not quite as good as the original, and you can't help but feel like you're just going through the motions. Dissidia Final Fantasy. Dissidia Final Fantasy, the fighting game that took all your favorite characters and threw them into an arena of mediocrity. The battle system, while initially intriguing, quickly devolves into a repetitive and shallow experience that feels less like a strategic fight and more like a button-mashing marathon. The story is a convoluted mess filled with nonsensical plot twists and contrived character interactions that feel more like fanfiction than an actual Final Fantasy game. The controls are a nightmare, with a camera that seems to have a mind of its own and a targeting system that's as reliable as a chocolate teapot.
That's pretty good.
The leveling and equipment system feels tacked on, adding little depth or customization to the overall experience. And let's not forget the cringeworthy voice acting. It's like listening to a group of amateur thespians trying their hardest to sound epic. Dissidia Final Fantasy tells us that sometimes less is more, and not every franchise needs to dabble in every genre. Final Fantasy XIV Online. Final Fantasy XIV Online is the MMO that took one of the most beloved series and turned it into as soulless a grindfest as it could ever be. The story tries to be epic, but in the end, it's such a generic affair, filled with bland characters and uninspired plot lines that feel as though they were written by a committee of accountants. The gameplay is bogged down by tedious fetch quests and repetitive battles, with none of the charm or depth that made the series so memorable. The graphics are dated and lackluster, as if someone took a AAA game's art style and smeared Vaseline all over it. The community is a mixed bag, with some genuinely helpful players being overshadowed by a vocal minority of trolls and griefers. And let's not forget the egregious cash up. It's as if the developers looked at every predatory monetization tactic in the book and thought, hey, let's do all of that.
I like money.
Final Fantasy XIII 2. Final Fantasy XIII 2, again, is a sequel that no one asked for but got anyway, like an unwanted gift from an estranged relative. The time-traveling plot is a mess that feels like it was ripped straight from a bad fanfiction, complete with nonsensical time loops and paradoxes that leave you with a headache. The protagonist Sarah is as bland as spaghetti without any sauce, and the addition of Noelle, this bratty son of a bitch, does little to alleviate the boredom. The monster catching mechanic is a pale imitation of other, more successful franchises, and it's almost insulting how it tries to pass off this half-baked idea as a core gameplay feature. The game's locations, while visually impressive, are still linear and lifeless, with exploration feeling more like a chore than an adventure. And let's not forget the constant barrage of DLC. It's like the developers were trying to milk every last cent from the players. Final Fantasy Type 0. Final Fantasy Type 0, a game that takes the series' hallmark of complex storytelling and characters and manages to squander it with an inconsistent tone and bland gameplay. The game's cast of 14 playable characters is a double-edged sword. While it provides variety, it also leads to shallow character development and a narrative spread so thin it's practically transparent. The combat system, while fast-paced, often devolves into a chaotic mess, leaving you mashing buttons and hoping for the best. The game's difficulty spikes are as erratic as a caffeinated squirrel, with some battles being a cakewalk and others feeling like a Herculean task. The graphics, while decent, can't hide the game's portable roots, making for a less than stellar visual experience on consoles. And let's not forget the needlessly convoluted leveling system, which has you navigating an unholy mess of menus and options just to upgrade your characters. Final Fantasy Type 0 is a game that tries to do too much and ultimately fails to excel at any of it. Dissidia Duodecim Final Fantasy. Dissidia Duodecim Final Fantasy, the game that is supposed to be a fun concept and, much like the first game, managed to suck all the fun out of it like a fun-sucking vampire. The story mode is an incomprehensible mess that only the most die-hard of Final Fantasy fans will even attempt to decipher, and even then, it's just not worth the effort. The game's maps are a confusing labyrinth of corridors that are about as fun to navigate as a tax form. The combat, which should have been the game's saving grace, is marred by a counterintuitive control scheme that turns each battle into an exercise in frustration. The leveling system is as slow as molasses, with characters taking eons to gain abilities and become viable fighters. And finally, the customization options are so needlessly complex and poorly explained that you'll spend more time fiddling with menus than actually playing the game. Dissidia Final Fantasy Games took a great idea and buried it under layers of poor design choices. Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII. Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII, the trilogy's finale that somehow manages to be as much disappointing or on some aspects even more dumb than its predecessors. The game's Doomsday Clock mechanic is about as welcome as a dental appointment, forcing players to rush through the game with the constant threat of failure hanging over their heads. The stupidly nonsensical story makes it hard to care about the characters or their plight, and the dialogue is so cringe-worthy that you'll be begging for a mute button. The combat, which was once the series' semi-decent suit, is a darker shadow of its formerly shadowy self, and with the game's restrictive schemata system feeling like an unnecessary limitation. The side quests are as dull as dishwater, with the majority of them amounting to little more than fetch quests or monster-slaying chores. And lastly, the game's graphics, once a shining example of the series' visual prowess, now look dated and unimpressive. Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII is a disappointing end to an already controversial trilogy, a game that ultimately leaves players feeling relieved that it's finally over. World of Final Fantasy. World of Final Fantasy, a game that's like a cake made of cardboard. It looks tasty, but take a bite and you'll find it's all style and no substance. The chibi art style, while adorable, is clearly aimed at a younger audience, alienating the older Final Fantasy fanbase. The story is a not surprisingly mess that is more concerned with cramming in as many fan-favorite characters as possible than telling a coherent tale. The combat system, which should be simple and engaging, is bogged down by the stacking mechanic that turns battles into a tedious balancing act. The mirage collecting and training aspects of the game are shameless Pokemon ripoffs that feel uninspired and derivative. And finally, the game's pacing is slower than a snail race, with players rooting through dull dungeons and repetitive quests that make even the most ardent Final Fantasy fan question their love for the series. World of Final Fantasy is a game that tries to coast on nostalgia, but ends up feeling like a pale imitation of the series' best moments. Final Fantasy VII Remake. For the last one, we have Final Fantasy VII Remake, a game that set out to recapture the magic of a beloved classic, but instead opted to rewrite history in the most baffling way possible. While the updated graphics and combat system are undeniably impressive, the game's decision to deviate from the original story leaves a bitter taste in the mouth of longtime fans. The game's pacing is all over the place, with the expanded content feeling like unnecessary padding that serves only to drag out the experience. The side quests, which should have added depth to the game, are tedious and uninspired, feeling more like filler content than meaningful additions.
Get some help.
The Whispers, a new plot device introduced in the remake, are about as welcome as a migraine, making the story feel confusing and comedic. And lastly, the episodic nature of the remake is a massive disappointment, as players are left with an incomplete experience and the knowledge that the full story will be locked behind multiple games and years of waiting. Final Fantasy VII Remake had the potential to be a triumphant return to form, but instead, it's a game that leaves fans feeling conflicted and frustrated. Hey, congratulations on making it this far! If you've reached this point and didn't immediately jump to the comment section midway to send hate, then you're not a crybaby. Haha. Joke aside, this video is an extreme exaggeration of the negative things that the community says about each game, twisted in the most brutally creative way possible. Since nothing will ever be good enough for everyone, I might as well just go to the extremes. For more content about Final Fantasy, check out the links below or at the top of the video. See you next time!